2. Choosing the topic. 2.1 Monograph or survey. The first temptation of any student is to write a thesis that is too broad. For example, the first impulse of a literature student is to write a thesis titled Literature Today. If advised to narrow the scope, the student might choose Italian literature from the post-war period to the 60s, a topic with slightly more focus, but one that is still impossibly vast. A thesis like this is dangerous. Such a topic will make a seasoned scholar tremble, and will present an impossible challenge for a young student. Presented with this challenge, a student will either write a tedious survey consisting only of authors' names and current scholarly opinions, or will try to imitate the approach of a mature critic and will inevitably be accused of unforgivable omissions. In 1957, the great contemporary Italian critic Gianfranco Contini published a survey titled Letteratura Italiana, Ottocento Novecento, Italian Literature, the 19th and 20th centuries. Had the survey been a thesis, it would have earned a failing grade, despite its 472 pages in length. Contini dedicated entire chapters to so-called minor authors, and relegated certain major authors to mentions in short footnotes or omitted them altogether. The committee would have attributed these choices to carelessness or ignorance. Naturally, since Contini is a scholar of recognized historical knowledge and critical acumen, readers understood that the omissions and disproportions were intentional, and that the absence of a particular author was a more eloquent expression of Contini's disfavor than a hostile review. But if a student in his 20s plays the same trick, who guarantees that there is shrewdness behind his silence? Do the omissions replace criticism that the student has written elsewhere, or that he would be capable of writing? Usually, with a thesis of this kind, the student later accuses the committee members of having failed to understand him. But a thesis that is too broad cannot be understood, and therefore is always an act of pride. It is not that intellectual pride in a thesis should be rejected a priori. A student can even argue that Dante was a lousy poet, but only after at least 300 pages of rigorous analysis of Dante's texts. However, the necessary breadth of a topic like Italian literature from the post-war period to the 60s leaves no space for these demonstrations, and this is why the student should aptly choose something more modest. Not the novels of Beppe Fenoglio, but the different versions of Johnny the Partisan. Boring? Maybe, but the challenge it presents is ultimately more interesting. If you think about it, specificity is also an act of shrewdness. A survey of 40 years of literature is vulnerable to all kinds of objections. How can the advisor or another committee member resist the temptation to show his knowledge of a minor author absent from the student's work? If each committee member jots down even 2 or 3 omissions in the margins of the table of contents, the thesis will end up looking like a missing persons list, and the student will become the target of a burst of charges. If instead the student works diligently on a specific topic, he will find himself mastering material unknown to most of the committee members. I am not suggesting a cheap trick. It may be a trick, but it takes hard work, so it is certainly not cheap. The candidate simply presents himself as expert in front of a less expert audience, and since he worked hard to gain his expertise, it is fair that he benefits from the situation. Between these two extremes of a 40-year literature survey and a strict monograph on the variants of a short text, there are thesis topics of varying scope. We can find topics like the new literary avant-garde of the 60s, or the image of the Lang in Pavese and Fenoglio, or even similarities and differences in 3 writers of the fantastic, Savinio, Bozzati, and Landolfi. As for the sciences, a little book on the same topic as ours gives advice that is valid for all subjects. The subject geology, for instance, is much too broad a topic. Volcanology, as a branch of geology, is still too comprehensive. Volcanoes in Mexico might be developed into a good but superficial paper. However, a further limitation to the history of Popocatépetl, which one of Cortés' conquistadores probably climbed in 1519 and which erupted violently as late as 1702, would make for a more valuable study. Another limited topic, spanning fewer years, would be the birth and apparent death of Pericoutin, February 20th, 1943, to March 4th, 1952.1. Here, I would suggest the last topic, but only if the candidate really says all there is to say about that damned volcano. Some time ago a student approached me with the impossibly broad topic the symbol in contemporary thought. At the very least, I did not understand what the student meant by symbol, a term that has different meanings to different authors, meanings that are sometimes directly opposed. Consider that formal logicians and mathematicians designate with the term symbol certain expressions without meaning that occupy a specific place with a specific function in a given formalized calculus, such as the A and B or X and Y of algebraic formulas, whereas other authors use the term to mean a form full of ambiguous meanings, such as images in dreams, in which a tree can refer to a sex organ, the desire of growth, and so on. So how can anybody write a thesis with this title? One would have to analyze all of the meanings of symbol in all of contemporary culture, list their similarities and differences, determine whether there is an underlying fundamental unitary concept in each author and each theory, and whether the differences nevertheless make the theories in question incompatible. Well then, no contemporary philosopher, linguist, or psychoanalyst has yet been able to complete such a work satisfactorily. How can a neophyte succeed? How can we expect such a work from a young student who, albeit precocious, has no more than 6 or 7 years of academic reading behind him? Even if he could intelligently write at least part of an argument, he would still face the problems of Contini's history of Italian literature. Alternatively, he could neglect the work of other authors and propose his own theory of the symbol, but we will discuss this questionable choice in section 2.2. I spoke with the student in question. We discussed the possibility of a thesis on symbol in Freud and Jung, one that would have excluded all other definitions of the term and would have compared only the meanings given to it by these two authors. Then I learned that the student's only foreign language was English. We will return to the question of foreign language skills in section 2.5. We then settled on the concept of symbol in purse, a thesis that would require only English language skills. Naturally, over the course of the thesis, the student would have described how Purse's definition of the term differed from that of authors such as Freud and Jung, but these German-speaking authors would not be central to the thesis. Nobody could object that the student had read these authors only in translation, since the thesis proposed to study only the American author fully and in the original language. In this way, we managed to limit the survey to a medium length, while not changing it into a strict monograph. This solution was acceptable to all. I should also clarify that the term monograph can have a broader meaning than the one we have used here. A monograph is the study of a single topic, and as such it is opposed to a history of, a manual, and an encyclopedia. A monograph can analyze many writers, but only from the perspective of a specific theme. For example, a monograph could appropriately be titled The Theme of the World Turned Upside Down in Medieval Writers, and it could explore the paradox in which fish can fly, birds can swim, and so on. The student could write an excellent monograph on this topic if he worked rigorously. However, this topic would include a vast amount of readings, as the student would need to familiarize himself with all the writers who treated the subject, however minor or obscure. The student might do well to narrow his scope to the theme of the world turned upside down in Carolingian poets. A student may consider a survey more exciting than a monograph, if only because focusing on the same author for 1, 2, or more years may seem boring. But the student should understand that a strict monograph also involves the author's cultural and historical context. A thesis on Beppe Fenoglio's fiction requires reading related writers such as Cesare Pavese or Elio Vittorini, reading the American writers whom Fenoglio read and translated, and examining Italian realism in general. It is only possible to understand and interpret an author within his wider cultural context. However, it is one thing for a portraitist to paint a landscape for his subject's background, and it is another thing to paint a complete, detailed landscape painting. The portrait of a gentleman might contain the countryside with a river in the background, but a landscape contains fields, valleys, and rivers, all in fine detail. The technique or, in photographic terms, the focus must change between the two. In a monograph, the landscape can even be somewhat out of focus, incomplete, or unoriginal. Finally, remember this fundamental principle. The more you narrow the field, the better and more safely you will work. Always prefer a monograph to a survey. It is better for your thesis to resemble an essay than a complete history or an encyclopedia. 2.2 Historical or theoretical? This choice only applies to certain subjects. A thesis in history of mathematics, Romance philology, history of German literature, and other similar subjects can only be historical. A thesis on experimental subjects such as architectural composition, nuclear reactor physics, or comparative anatomy is usually theoretical. But there are other subjects such as theoretical philosophy, sociology, cultural anthropology, aesthetics, philosophy of law, pedagogy, or international law that allow a thesis of both kinds. In a theoretical thesis, a student confronts an abstract problem upon which other works may or may not have already reflected: the nature of human will, the concept of freedom, the notion of social role, the existence of God, or the genetic code. Considered together, such topics may elicit smiles, as they require the writer to compose what Antonio Gramsci called brief notes on the universe. And yet illustrious thinkers have devoted themselves to such topics. However, they usually did so after decades of reflection. In the hands of less experienced students, these topics can generate two outcomes. The first and less worrisome is a survey like the one defined in the previous section, on which I have already provided observations. For example, the student tackles the concept of social role as it appears in the writings of a chosen set of authors. The second outcome is more tragic, because the candidate presumes he can solve the question of God or define the concept of freedom within only a few pages. My experience is that a thesis like this usually turns out to be short and unorganized, and resembles more a lyric poem than an academic study. Usually, when the committee objects to the candidate's argument as too personalized, generic, informal, and lacking in historiographic verification and evidence, the candidate responds that he has been misunderstood, and that his thesis is more intelligent than other banal literature surveys. This may be true, but this answer usually comes from a candidate with confused ideas, one who lacks academic humility and communicative skills. I will define academic humility, which requires pride, and is not a virtue for the weak, in section 4.2.4. This candidate may indeed be a genius who has acquired a lifetime of knowledge in a mere 22 years, and let it be clear that I am presenting this hypothesis without any shade of irony. However, it takes a long time for mankind to notice that such a genius has appeared on the Earth's crust, and his work must be read and digested for a certain number of years before its greatness is grasped. How can we expect that the busy committee, responsible for so many students, should grasp at first sight the greatness of this lone runner? Let us hypothesize that the student believes he has understood an important problem. Since nothing is born from nothing, the student must have developed his thoughts under a particular author's influence. In this case, he should transform his theoretical thesis into a historiographic thesis. In other words, he should not discuss the problem of being, the notion of freedom, or the concept of social action, but develop a topic such as the question of being in early Heidegger, the notion of freedom in Kant, or the concept of social action in Parsons. His original ideas will emerge as he grapples with his author's ideas, as it is possible to say new things about freedom while studying an author's work on the concept. If he is ambitious, he can transform the theoretical thesis that he originally conceived into the final chapter of his historiographic thesis. Consequently, readers will understand his original ideas in the context of a previous thinker, and the concepts he proposes will gain support from their proper frame of reference. Even the brightest young writer will find it difficult to work in a vacuum and establish an argument ab initio. He must find a foothold in past scholarship, especially for questions as vague as the notions of being and freedom. Even if someone is a genius, and especially if someone is a genius, he will never be diminished by starting from another author's work. Building on a previous author's work does not mean a student must fetishize, adore, or swear by that author, and in fact the student can demonstrate the author's errors and limits. Medieval writers saw themselves as dwarfs compared to the giant ancients they revered, and yet they could see further than the ancients because they were dwarfs standing on the shoulders of giants. Not all of these observations are valid for applied and laboratory-based subjects. In psychology, for example, the alternative to the question of perception in PSA is not the question of perception, even if there were a student reckless enough to attempt such a dangerously generic topic. The alternative to the first topic's historiographic approach is rather an experimental approach, such as the perception of colors in a group of handicapped children. This is a different story, because the student has the right to approach a question through experimentation, provided he has a sound research method, adequate laboratory conditions, and the necessary assistance. But a good laboratory researcher will not begin an experiment without having compiled a literature review that examines the results of similar experiments. He would otherwise risk reinventing the wheel by proving something that has already been amply proven, or by applying methods that have already failed, although the new verification of a heretofore unsuccessful method could provide the foundation for a successful thesis. Therefore, an experimental thesis requires library research, laboratory work, and an established research method. Here the student should follow the examples of the medieval authors and climb onto the shoulders of a giant, at least one of modest height, or even onto another dwarf. The student will always have the chance to develop his own original ideas later in his career. 2.3 Ancient or Contemporary. Here I am not attempting to revive the age-old quarrel of the ancients and the moderns. Instead I am here using the term ancient in the most general sense of very old, referring to authors whose works have survived and been studied by scholars. The choice between an ancient and a contemporary author does not apply to subjects such as the history of contemporary Italian literature, although even a thesis in Latin could involve both Horace and the state of Horatian studies in the last 2 decades. Nevertheless, Italian students frequently prefer contemporary authors, like Cesare Pavese, Giorgio Bassani, and Edoardo Sanguinetti, to the 16th century Petrarchan or the 18th century Arcadian poets suggested by their advisors. Sometimes the student chooses a poet out of an authentic love for his work, and this is a choice that is difficult to challenge. Other times the student is under the false conviction that a contemporary author is easier and more fun. Let us state from the outset that a thesis on a contemporary author is always more difficult. It may be true that scholarship on a contemporary author generally involves a smaller bibliography of easily accessible texts, and that the student can accomplish the first phase of the research by reading a good novel on the beach, rather than sitting in a library. The problem arises when the student begins to comment on the author, considering that the thesis will be flawed if he simply repeats what other critics have said. If the student is to write a flawed thesis, he could do so more easily on a 16th century Petrarchan poet. Since opinions on most contemporary authors are still vague and divided, the student's critical skills will be hindered by a lack of perspective, and the project will become enormously difficult. On the other hand, the texts of ancient authors are usually supported by a solid foundation of interpretation upon which the student can build. Certainly a thesis on an ancient author involves more laborious reading and more careful bibliographical research, but the titles are more organized, and complete bibliographies are common. Moreover, if the student approaches his thesis as a chance to learn how to properly conduct research, a thesis on a past author will provide better training. And even if the student has a flair for contemporary criticism, the thesis can provide a final opportunity for him to challenge himself with literature of the past, and to exercise his taste and reading skills. He would be in good company, for many great contemporary authors, even avant-garde authors, wrote their thesis on Dante or Foscolo rather than Monteil or Count. To be sure, there are no precise rules, and a good researcher can historically or stylistically analyze a contemporary or past author with equal philological acumen and precision. The problem also varies among disciplines. In philosophy, a thesis on Husserl might provide the student with a more challenging research experience than one on Descartes, and the fact that it is easier to read Pascal than Carnap shows that a modern author may require more laborious reading than an ancient. Therefore, I can confidently provide only this advice. Work on a contemporary author as if he were ancient, and an ancient one as if he were contemporary. You will have more fun and write a better thesis. 2.4 How long does it take to write a thesis? Let us state from the outset, no longer than 3 years and no less than 6 months. This period includes not just the time necessary to write the final draft, which may take only a month or 2 weeks, depending on the student's work habits. Instead, this period begins at the genesis of the first idea and ends at the delivery of the final work. For example, a student may only work on his thesis for a year, but he may use ideas and readings accumulated in the 2 preceding years, even though he initially did not know what would come from this preliminary research. A thesis should take no more than 3 years because, if the student has failed to delimit his topic and find the necessary sources after this period, he has one of the following problems. 1. The student has chosen an overwhelming topic that is beyond his skill level. 2. The student is one of those insatiable persons who would like to write about everything, and who will continue to work on his thesis for 20 years. A clever scholar will instead set limits, however modest, and produce something definitive within those limits. 3. The thesis neurosis has begun. The student abandons the thesis, returns to it, feels unfulfilled, loses focus, and uses his thesis as an alibi to avoid other challenges in his life that he is too cowardly to address. This student will never graduate. A thesis should take no less than 6 months because, even if the student's goal is a modest journal article of less than 60 typewritten pages, 6 months pass in a flash. This may not be sufficient time for the student to structure the work, research the bibliography, catalogue the sources, and draft the text. Surely a more experienced scholar can compose an essay in less time, but only because he has years of reading behind him, complete with catalogued notes. The student must instead start from scratch. Ideally, the student will choose his thesis topic and thesis advisor toward the end of his sophomore year. By then the student has already become familiar with various subjects, and he even has a general understanding of disciplines he has not yet studied, their focus, and the difficulties they present. Such a timely choice is neither compromising nor irreversible. The student has an entire year to assess the choice, and if need be, to change the topic, the advisor, or even the discipline. Note that even if the student spends a year researching ancient Greek literature and later realizes that he prefers contemporary history, he has not wasted his time, as he will have learned how to create a preliminary bibliography, how to take notes on a text, and how to organize a table of contents. Remember the point we made in section 1.3, first and foremost, a thesis teaches one to coordinate ideas, and the topic is secondary. If the student chooses his topic toward the end of his sophomore year, he will have until the spring of the 4th year to graduate well within the time frame outlined above. He will have 2 complete years to finish his thesis and 2 summers to devote to research and, if he has the resources, to research trips. During this period, he can also choose courses and readings that are appropriate for his thesis. To be sure, if the student is writing a thesis on experimental psychology, he will still be required to take Latin or other unrelated courses. However, in courses related to philosophy and sociology, the student may be able to arrange with the professor to substitute texts related to the thesis for course texts, even required ones, as long as this is done without dialectical contortions or puerile tricks. In this case, an intelligent professor will prefer a motivated student taking his course purposefully to one taking his course without passion, randomly, or out of an obligation to fulfill a requirement. In any case, nothing forbids the student from choosing a thesis topic earlier, and nothing forbids the student from choosing it later, if he is willing to take more than the prescribed 4 years to graduate. But the biggest mistake he can make is to fail to allow sufficient time for his thesis. If the student is to write a good thesis, he must discuss his work incrementally with his advisor, at least within reason. This is not to put the professor on a pedestal. Instead, because writing a thesis is like writing a book, working incrementally with the professor is a communication exercise that assumes the existence of an audience, and the advisor is the only competent audience available to the student during the course of his work. If the student completes the thesis hastily, the advisor will only have time to skim the text. Moreover, if the student presents the thesis to his advisor at the last minute, and if the advisor is dissatisfied with the results, he will challenge the candidate at the defense. This will produce unpleasant results not only for the student but also for the advisor, who should never arrive at a defense with a thesis he does not support. In this case, the advisor shares in the defeat. Early in the process, if the advisor notices that the candidate is having trouble, he must immediately inform the candidate, and suggest either that the student pursue another topic or that he postpone his thesis until he is better prepared. If the student ignores this advice, and if he is in a rush to graduate or if he simply believes that his advisor is wrong, he will again face a stormy defense, but he will do so deliberately. Considering these risks, a 6-month thesis is certainly not the optimum choice, even though it is within our range of acceptability. But as we have implied, it may prove successful if the topic, chosen in the last 6 months, builds on research and experience gained in the years before. Also, sometimes a student must complete a thesis in 6 months because of some external necessity. In these cases, the student must find a topic that he can research thoroughly and that will yield a decent product in that short period of time. Here I do not want to sound too much like a salesman, as if I was selling an inexpensive 6-month thesis and a pricier 3-year thesis, a thesis to satisfy every kind of customer. Instead, my point is that, without a doubt, a student can produce a decent thesis in as little as 6 months. There are 3 requirements for a 6-month thesis. 1. The topic should be clearly defined. 2. The topic should be contemporary, notwithstanding the advice given in section 2.3, eliminating the need to explore a bibliography that goes back to the ancient Greeks. Alternatively, it should be a marginal subject on which little has been written. 3. The primary and secondary sources must be locally available and easily accessible. Let us look at some examples. If I choose the topic the Church of Santa Maria di Castello in Alessandria, I can hope to find everything I need to reconstruct its history and the events of its restoration in the Municipal Library of Alessandria, and also in the city's civic archives. I use the word hope because I am speaking hypothetically, and putting myself in the shoes of a student who hopes to complete a thesis in 6 months. Before I begin the project, I should test the validity of my hypothesis. First, I should verify that I will reside in or near Alessandria during the process. If I live 930 miles south in Caltanissetta, I have made a bad choice.